To listen ad-free, visit sinspod.co/subscribe. Starting at $2.99 a month, you'll also get access to our exclusive bonus content episodes when you join through Patreon or Apple subscriptions. Thanks for supporting the show. In January 2009, it seemed like the murder case against Thomas Randolph would be moving forward to bring him to justice for the murders of Mike Miller and his wife Sharon Randolph. Finally, he would face some accountability for the decades of pain he had caused.
Throughout his life, Thomas Randolph always seemed to be able to escape serious consequences for his actions, even being acquitted of the murder of his second wife and serving a very light sentence for conspiracy to commit murder for hiring a hitman to murder the prosecution's star witness in that case.
In Part 4, we'll talk about the trial and explain why it took over 15 years for justice to finally be served.
Hi, and welcome to Sins and Survivors, a Las Vegas true crime podcast where we focus on domestic violence, missing persons, and unsolved cases. I'm your host, Sean, and with me, as always, is the one and only John.
I am the only John in the room.
This week, we are bringing you Part 4, the finale of our 4-part series on the Black Widower, Thomas Randolph. If you haven't listened to the previous parts, you need to. Go back and listen to those, and we'll be waiting right here. Just a quick recap of last week. Thomas Randolph was charged with the murder of his second wife, Becky Galtz, after Becky was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Her death was originally ruled a suicide, but additional evidence came to light. A friend of Tom's, Eric Tarantino, told police that Tom had tried to coerce him into murdering Becky. In his many conversations with Eric about how he would kill Becky, staging a suicide was one of the plans Tom came up with. During the trial, Tom tried to hire a hitman to kill Eric, but the hitman he attempted to hire was actually an undercover cop. Despite all of this, Tom was ultimately acquitted of Becky's murder and received a minimal penalty for felony witness tampering for trying to find a hitman to kill Eric Tarantino.
As we mentioned, Tom was finally arrested for the murders of Sharon and Mike Miller after an exhaustive nationwide investigation into his relationships and background and the discovery that of the 6 wives he's had, 4 of them were dead. The case was presided over by Judge Stephanie Miley, and on January 21st, 2009, Randolph pleaded not guilty to charges of first-degree murder with a deadly weapon for both Sharon and Mike Miller and conspiracy to commit murder. This has seemed to be a common thread in stories we've covered recently, but Tom Randolph did everything he could to prevent the trial from starting. In the court records, you can see there are hundreds of motions filed, and Tom fired 10 lawyers in a never-ending delay campaign that often coincided with the days the trial was scheduled to begin. When that happened, the trial was just delayed again. Lawyers clearly understood this was a part of his strategy. At one point, he even tried to apply to represent himself, which any lawyer or judge will tell you is a very bad idea. Tom was an impossible client. He was constantly second-guessing the defense team of the moment, seeming to think that he knew better than they did how to mount his defense. He had previously worked with lawyers in his work, it's unclear when, and one of his lawyers said that he was intelligent but extremely hard to represent. On February 9, 2009, prosecutors filed their intention to seek the death penalty for Randolph.
One of the main sticking points between the prosecution and the defense was whether the prosecution would be allowed to talk about the case of Randolph's second wife, Becky Galtz, which was the first time he was tried for murder with a prosecutor seeking the death penalty. There are obvious similarities between the 1986 case in Utah and the 2009 death of Sharon Randolph, which made it seem relevant to the Sharon Randolph case. Both cases involve Randolph locating, befriending, and grooming a hitman to kill his wife, and in both cases, Randolph took out large life insurance policies with himself as the beneficiary. With the death penalty on the table for the second time in his life, you'd think that Randolph might be concerned, but not Tom. In various interviews, he never seemed concerned. In an interview with NBC News, he couldn't control his unbelievable smugness and said things like, "It's not a big deal. I'm glad they made this a death penalty case. And I'd have felt cheated if it wasn't a death penalty case. And This seems like a death penalty kind of case. It's almost as if he didn't understand the gravity of the situation and that he was actually at risk of being sentenced to death, like he was watching someone else's life.
One of Randolph's lawyers was Brent Bryson, a former O.J. Simpson defense team member with an interesting history. Bryson was involved in an altercation in a bar when he was much younger, which resulted in the death of another bar patron. He was charged with manslaughter and ultimately acquitted. According to Bryson, his acquittal fueled his passion for his work as a defense attorney. It was Bryson who argued in front of Judge Miley that the Utah murder of Becky Galt should not be introduced into Sharon's murder case. He argued that Randolph was acquitted in that case, and he had exercised his option available under Utah law to have the case sealed. Therefore, the prosecution should not be allowed to discuss it. Bryson went on to claim that Tom had no significant criminal history, which is patently false and a bit absurd, even if you ignore the murder trial. He did, remember, spend time in jail after the conspiracy to commit murder charge, which he pled down to felony witness tampering, not to mention the drug charges through the years. The prosecution argued that Becky's death was relevant and showed a pattern of behavior, and brought in the original prosecutor from Becky's murder trial to describe the facts of what happened in that case, instead of bringing anyone in offering direct evidence like Eric Tarantino, for example. It was clear that the defense realized that the prosecution discussing the Utah case would be incredibly damaging to their current case. Ultimately, Judge Miley ruled that the Utah case could be brought in, making the defense's job much harder. Just after that ruling, Tom fired Bryson, delaying the trial again. This occurred a year and a half after his original arrest in 2009. Because of all the delays, the trial didn't proceed until 2017.
We've talked before about the difference between circumstantial and direct evidence, and this is one of those cases where there was very little direct evidence just because the people who could have given direct evidence of the night of the murders were gone. Essentially, most of the case was built on strong circumstantial evidence. That's not necessarily a problem if the evidence is compelling and the prosecution could convince the jury of Tom's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence just has to be cohesive and involve facts that, when considered together, lead to a conclusion of guilt. The prosecution brought in a parade of witnesses who lived in Las Vegas, as well as flying them in from all over the country. As you'd expect, they called Sharon's daughter Colleen, along with Sharon's coworkers from the salon, Alice and Deirdre, all of whom gave testimony about how Sharon grew unhappy during the marriage and about all of those red flags they saw in the relationship. There was also Mark, the neighbor who heard the gunshots the night of the murder, who provided compelling direct testimony on the timing of the gunshots compared with the time Tom called 911, showing that despite what Tom claimed, he didn't call 911 right away. He waited nearly 15 minutes. 15 minutes, which might have made the difference in saving Sharon's life. The prosecution also brought in Catherine Thomas, Tom's first wife, to testify that Tom was controlling, manipulative, and psychologically abusive. She even cited the example of Tom throwing the oatmeal against the wall in a rage because it didn't have sugar on it. Gaina Allman, Tom's third wife, was brought in too, of course, and told the story of how Tom was cleaning his gun at the dining room table and it just went off, coming within a foot of hitting her, and then describing how she decided then and there to get out as soon as she could, fearing for her life.
Since they were allowed to talk about Becky's murder, the prosecution brought in Eric Tarantino, who, of course, you'll remember, was Randolph's planned accomplice hitman. Tom attempted to coerce Eric into killing Becky, just as he would years later with Mike Miller in the murder of his wife Sharon. The difference was that instead of participating in the plan, Tarantino warned Becky and then fled to New Hampshire. The prosecution said at one point that the only reason Mike Miller was dead is that Eric Tarantino refused to kill Becky and fled the state, and Tom wasn't going to make that mistake again. Eric testified that he was still terrified of Tom Randolph, that he would come after him, and he said that until Tom was dead, he'd be sleeping with a gun next to his bed. The detective in the Utah case, Scott Connolly, testified as well, and from his reaction before the trial and interviews, he was happy to be there and hoping that Tom Randolph would finally be put away for a very long time. Wendy, the woman that Tom was dating after Becky's death, testified that Tom convinced her to take his car title to a man that Wendy believed would help in Tom's defense. She brought her 8-year-old son with her, thinking she was running a simple errand. She was unaware that the car title was being offered as payment for a hitman to kill Eric Tarantino, and she was offering that payment to an undercover cop. The police officer pointed a gun at her head when they placed her under arrest. The prosecution finished by calling Dean O'Kelly, who probably knew the most about Tom Randolph, his history, his wives, his crime, and his current case. O'Kelly testified about everything from his initial involvement in the case, through the reenactment, through their search into Tom's past, all the way up to Tom's arrest in 2009. The defense only called one witness, Tom's older brother, and the only part of his testimony that could have had any impact on the case at all was when he explained that it was him who had driven Tom to the reenactment that he did with the detectives 7 days after Sharon's murder. He testified that Tom couldn't drive because he was under the influence of unknown prescription drugs and probably shouldn't even have participated in the reenactment that night. After that, they chose not to have Tom testify in his own defense, even though it was his right to face his accusers and answer questions. It would have been pretty risky, though, to put Tom on the stand because he would have been subject to cross-examination by the prosecution. The jury deliberated for 4 hours the first day, and then, on the second day, returned a verdict. They found him guilty of all charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, murder with the use of a deadly weapon, and first-degree murder.
Next up was the sentencing or penalty phase, and remember that the state was seeking the death penalty for Tom Randolph. In this phase, the prosecution brought in witnesses who could attest to the immeasurable harm Tom had done to their lives. Rachel Gaskin, the daughter of Francis Randolph, Thomas's fifth wife, the one right before Sharon, her testimony was an emotional bombshell. She told a story about a day that her mom, Frances, went out and got Burger King for them, and because Burger King had put mayonnaise on Tom's sandwich, he flew into a rage and slammed the sandwich into her face. She also told the story of the night her mom died and how she had to live with the fact that there would never be proof of anything because Tom had her mom cremated right away. On day 2 of sentencing, unbelievably, Tom insisted on wearing a Dallas Cowboys Tony Romo jersey, which is highly irregular and indicates a level of contempt for the court and everyone involved. The defense brought in his children, Krista and Justice, who told the court what a great dad he was, which, according to jurors later, had absolutely no impact. They also brought in his mother, but again, the jurors weren't moved by her statements. Once the witnesses were done, Tom was allowed to give an allocution statement meant to impact the sentence he's given by demonstrating that he understands the harm he's caused and to express remorse. Tom decided not to go that route. He expressed that he felt like he was the victim and asked for life in prison instead of the death penalty. The jury decided to impose the death penalty on Tom. In an interview right after the sentencing, Tom said, "Now it's just 3 more years and we'll get a fair trial." He said that his lawyer told him that if the prosecution were allowed to bring in the Utah case, the Supreme Court would overturn any guilty verdict.
With the guilty verdict and the death sentence, news outlets moved on from the story, and most people thought that was the end of the Black Widower. Tom and his new lawyers filed an appeal, of course, right away, based on the 1986 murder of Becky being brought into Sharon's murder trial, and the appeal was heard by the Nevada Supreme Court. The court ruled that some of the information about Tom's prior bad acts could have been admissible to show proof of Tom's motive or intent, as long as the evidence being brought in would not unfairly prejudice the jury, which is something we've talked about before. The Nevada Supreme Court did find that parts of the evidence offered about Becky's death would be relevant, such as the evidence that he solicited Eric to murder Becky for insurance money and then tried to hire someone to kill Eric as well. There were too many similarities to overlook. In both instances, Tom groomed a friend, Handyman, to murder his wife for insurance money. Then he looked for a way to eliminate the men he conspired with. However, another key part of allowing bad acts into a trial is that the bad acts must be proven by clear and convincing evidence. When Judge Miley ruled on allowing the evidence of Becky's murder trial into the trial, the only witness was the prosecutor from that trial. The court didn't hear directly from Eric or anyone with direct knowledge of Tom's scheme, so the court was only relying on hearsay. Also, the Nevada Supreme Court emphasized that Tom had been acquitted of Becky's murder, which weakened the trial court's ability to rely on the prosecutor's statements as clear and convincing evidence that Tom was guilty of all that was alleged in that case.
The second issue was that when Eric Tarantino and Tom's ex-girlfriend, Wendy Moore, testified, they talked about things that included a lot of irrelevant and prejudicial evidence against Tom. For example, the fact that Tom had beaten Eric and stole his medication was seen as a prejudicial fact that was not at all related to Sharon's murder. Also, Wendy's testimony of how she was duped by Tom into delivering the payment to the undercover cop posing as a hitman showed that Tom didn't care about her safety or the safety of her child, which the court also found to be prejudicial and not relevant to Sharon's murder trial. As a result, the Nevada Supreme Court overturned his conviction and remanded the case back to the 8th Judicial District for an immediate new trial. Thankfully, Tom was not released from jail, and they just ordered that new trial. Once again, Colleen and Sharon's loved ones had to deal with the torture of additional delays in getting justice for Sharon. The new trial did not begin until August 2023, more than 15 years after Sharon's murder. This time, all the evidence about Becky's death, Tom's likely involvement, Eric Tarantino, etc., was not included. The prosecution also decided not to seek the death penalty this time, as Tom was nearly 69 years old.
In their opening statements to the jury, Chief Deputy District Attorney Chris Hammer told the jury that they were about to hear about 35 years of pain and anguish that Thomas Randolph had caused. Hammer went into detail about all the inconsistencies in Tom's story, such as the fact that Mike's ski mask had no bullet holes in it and no blood on it, proving that Tom didn't shoot him while Mike was wearing the mask, and certainly not in the head. He also explained that all the bullet casings from Tom's gun were found in the garage, not in the hallway where Tom had clearly told investigators that he had shot Mike. Tom also claimed that he called 911 immediately, but his neighbor testified that he had heard the shots 20 minutes before the police arrived. Hammer told the jury, when the defendant recounts what happened, he's the hero of his own story. However, the evidence in this case will show the defendant's story does not add up. One of the witnesses in the 2020 trial was Elizabeth, or Lizzie, the woman that Tom was having an affair with during his marriage to Sharon. We pointed out in part 2 how Tom was known for having multiple relationships at once, so no surprise he was dating someone else while he was married to Sharon. Lizzie testified that Tom had taken out a large insurance policy on her with Tom and Lizzie's daughter as beneficiaries. Lizzie said that she knew Tom was married to Sharon, and she was well aware that he was stringing them both along. Eventually, Lizzie got sick and tired of the arrangement. She told Tom that she was done with this back and forth, and she gave Tom an ultimatum. He'd have to break up with Sharon, or she was through with him. And Tom told her that he would deal with Sharon. Just a few months later, Sharon was murdered.
Tom's defense attorney countered back on this. He asked Lizzie if Tom ever came running back to her after Sharon was dead to be like, "She's gone, now we can be together." And Lizzie said no, that didn't happen. Presumably, the defense asked this question to show that Tom obviously didn't kill Sharon so he could be with Lizzie, and to refute what was implied by him saying he would deal with Sharon. In this trial, Colleen would have to testify again about her mother's relationship with Tom. The prosecution also played the disturbing voicemails Tom left for Colleen following her murder. The jurors also heard the call Thomas made to 911 the night Sharon was killed, and the various statements he made to detectives during the investigation. They also heard the evidence that Tom had called Mike Miller at least 3 times a day, as well as testimony from Mike's family about their relationship. The trial lasted 9 days, and during the second day of deliberations, August 24th, 2023, the jury found Thomas Randolph guilty of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. When the trial was over, Randolph's attorneys told Court TV that they weren't surprised by the verdict. They said that the jury was focused on how crass and unlikable Tom was. His attorneys told Court TV reporters that for the jurors, 2 key pieces of evidence were the most persuasive. One was the 911 call Tom made, and the other was the second interview he gave to police. The jurors also did not like Tom's relationship with Mike. They could tell there was something off about it. What really strikes me about that is this. In part 1, we told you that when the Las Vegas Metro detectives originally approached the district attorney seeking to have Tom arrested on charges of conspiracy and murder, the DAs were doubtful there was enough evidence to convict. They wanted the detectives to do more digging into Tom's history. The detectives did that, and they uncovered the details of Becky's suspicious death and Tom's involvement as well as everything about Frances, Catherine, and Gaina. But it was Becky's case, that evidence, that resulted in the 2017 conviction being overturned. And in the end, in 2023, Tom was found guilty mainly on the original evidence the detectives had collected, his statements to the police and the 911 call. I find that really interesting, and I think we'll talk more about that in this week's Swing Shift bonus episode.
Tom's sentencing was delayed when Tom's attorneys filed a 700-page motion to have the charges against him dismissed. Large portions of the motion were handwritten by Tom himself. The Review Journal described the document as rambling and illegible. The document did not persuade the judge, and his sentencing was put off for only about 6 months. Sentencing was held on April 4th, 2024. As of this recording, that was just a month ago. During the sentencing, DA Hammer said, "I don't think there's anything I can say that compares to the actions of Mr. Randolph in this case. The reality of his actions back in 2008 have rippled for year after year after year and will continue to do so." Tom was given the chance to speak before his sentence was imposed, of course, and the statement he made to the court is indescribably bizarre and shameful. For every compliment he gave to Sharon, he would then turn around and insult her in the next breath. He made some wild, unsubstantiated allegations against Colleen and Sharon, too, claiming that the two of them were conspiring to kill Colleen's husband. He also kept referring to Mike Miller as Uncle Mikey, which was weird and creepy, and it was completely unbelievable that anyone in her family had ever called him that. His entire statement was extremely disrespectful to Colleen and all of Sharon's loved ones, as well as to Mike's family, and was an insult to the judge's intelligence. D.A. Hammer summed it up perfectly. He's never going to take responsibility. It's always going to be someone else's fault, so that's what you saw today. In the end, Tom was sentenced to 60 years to life, and he did receive credit for nearly 15 years of time served. He's not eligible for parole until 2059. Colleen expressed her immense relief when it was over, saying, "It's been 15 years and it's been a twisted nightmare." In 2010, Colleen filed a civil case against Tom Randolph, and after 8 years, the judge issued a $12 million judgment in her favor. It's unclear how much of that money, if any, she will ever see.
Many of the cases we've covered here involve physical violence in the form of assaults and gun violence. This one is a bit different, but equally insidious. Tom Randolph was and is a master manipulator. He got 6 women to marry him shortly after meeting him, and if he's to be believed, he even had more fiancées in his life. He used his charm to lure these women in and inflicted mental, emotional, and physical abuse on all of them, while setting up life insurance policies on them, getting them addicted to drugs, and hoping he could find a person to murder them for the insurance money. It was a pattern he repeated again and again. If Tom had been found guilty in 1988 of Becky's murder, at least 2 lives would have been saved, and so many fewer lives would have been destroyed. Patterns of abuse aren't always obvious, and sometimes the abusers can be seen as great dads, but it's still important to look for and recognize these signs of abuse, however it manifests. It's not simple enough as saying someone just needs to leave, because you can see from the cases of Tom's wives that even though they wanted to leave, they were unable to do so. So we need to make sure that there are resources available for women to leave when they need to.
If you're enjoying the podcast, please tell your friends and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. If you want to listen ad-free, please consider joining our Patreon or by subscribing to Apple Podcasts. Just visit sinspod.co/subscribe. Thank you for listening, and we remind you, what happens here happens everywhere. Thanks for listening. Visit sinspod.co/subscribe for exclusive bonus content and to listen ad-free. Remember to like and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Threads at Sins and Survivors. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. You can contact us at questions@sinsandsurvivors.com.
If you or someone you know is affected by domestic violence or needs support, please reach out to local resources or the National Domestic Violence Hotline. A list of resources is available on our website, sinsandsurvivors.com. Sins and Survivors, a Las Vegas true crime podcast, is researched, written, and produced by your hosts, Sean and John. The information shared in this podcast is accurate at the time of recording. If you have questions, concerns, or corrections, please email us. Links to source material for this episode can be found on our website, sinsandsurvivors.com.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, hosts, and their guests. All individuals are innocent until proven guilty. This content does not constitute legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to consult with legal professionals for guidance.